Welcome back. Let's continue on into the human nature of nature. When we're talking about the human nature of nature, we're really trying to embed human concepts in the concept of nature itself. And this is ultimately going to lead us down the idea of social construction, and that nature is merely a social construction. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Um, when we think about this human nature of nature, we're talking about how people often put themselves at risk in defense of nature. And another way of thinking about nature is how nature is also a dangerous concept itself. There's some contradictions that we need to deal with when we talk about the human nature of nature. Moral holism versus moral separatism. Moral holism, of course, is that people are a part of nature. Therefore, we need to follow the quote unquote rules of nature. And then moral separatism is that people are apart from nature and that nature is different from us. Uh, we and nature are moved by different principles, and therefore, nature doesn't have a whole lot of meaning for us. And moral values, as we talk about moral values over the course of this semester, we always need to remember that a moral value requires a contrast, a way to make moral distinctions, but also serves as a point of connection for us to come back to. Power and interest is extremely important in the construction of the human nature of nature. Um, Power and interest is ultimately central to the concept of a natural conscience, or the lack thereof, power and interest. Um, we need to remember that depending on a person's subjective belief in a moral realm, which essentially lies beyond the reach of social power and possibility of manipulation to suit interests of some more than others. So we're now starting to get into this subjective construction of nature, where one person might have one concept of nature and another person might have another concept of nature. This requires a separation from society to be free from social influence, and it requires a holist unity in it if it's to be relevant to social issues. So this is, of course, unpacking the relevance of a natural conscience and how you construct one, where you would most likely do it, and what would the overall values and principles of a natural conscience look like. But we also have to remember that there is no holist unity in the conception of nature. Um, when we look back into classic interpretations of nature, we find that many of the classical thinkers had problems, and many of the classical thinkers tried to come up with solutions to those problems. Aristotle distinguished between natural and non natural. Anything that humans make is not due to nature, although the materials humans use may well be. For example, a wooden bed. The wood that's used to construct the bed is natural, but the actual construction of the bed is not natural. Um, Aristotle goes on to say that humans are also a part of nature because they have a source of change inside themselves. But once humans use the source of change to alter something outside themselves, they are not acting in accordance to nature. And these distinctions create points of moral connection and moral contrast. Uh, Aristotle wants to remind us that nature is interest-free, and in order to establish natural conscience, you have to be power and interest-free, which many argue is not completely possible. We might try to attain that, but never fully embrace the complete interest-free, power-free perspective that the natural conscience demands. We return back to the Taoists, of course, and moral connection. According to a Taoist, there's something larger and prior to humans. There is a way, there is a universal order that lies beyond the taint of human interests and desires. And that, for the Taoists, serves as the basis for a natural conscience. And the point of moral connection for the Taoists is this underlying first principle of everything, which includes humans. So for a Taoist, the humans are part of nature, not a part from. There's some contemporary contradictions of this the human nature of nature that we find taking shape in modern environmentalism. The word natural sets clear moral contrasts between ultimately a good and a bad. This, of course, is a dubious moral claim. Things that come about through our own internal source of change are natural and not the product of human desire and interests. But this forces us to ask the question once again, aren't humans a part of nature? Well, that's part of the contradiction that this debate takes us into, and it's not clear cut, and you have to come up to your own conclusion on this. This concept of wilderness as natural becomes important in the discussion of the human nature of nature. We often see the fullest expression of the true ends of nature, especially in reference to environmentalism. Wilderness, which equals land set aside from deliberate human interference. So we now can start to wrap our mind around what wilderness actually is. This land set aside from deliberate human interference. This creates a contradiction where this contradiction isn't the very setting aside of land a deliberate human action, thereby making wilderness the product of human intention rather than the result of its absence. And this is the type of paradox, this is the type of conundrum, the enigma, the chicken and egg situation that we run into over and over in this particular discussion area. This, of course, brings us to maybe the most important concept of the semester, the social construction of nature. And this, as with any other social construction, if you've taken any sociology classes, you know what a social construction is. It's essentially accepting the fact that we as humans made it up. Nature is something we make as much as it makes us. It's how we interpret, the subjective interpretation of nature, and each of us is going to interpret it in somewhat of a different way. As we see, nature depends upon our perspective on social life, and these perspectives change across time and place, history and culture. And when they change, nature changes with it.